The third area is Colombia.
Little was known about BCCI until 6 of its top officers were arrested in Tampa in October of 1988 on charges of laundering drug money for Colombian cocaine bosses. The BCCI men were convicted, and the bank itself pleaded guilty. But for some reason, the bank was allowed to continue to operate all over the world, and investigators say U.S. prosecutors failed to follow up on evidence of widespread corruption and other crimes that this month finally led to the bank being shut down.
I don't want to say that we invented cocaine production there, but it has massively increased since it was originally 1962, I think, when under Kennedy, the United States was very concerned about Castro having taken over in Cuba and frightened that he would export revolution to Latin America, and Colombia would be like the coastline that is closest to Cuba. So they initiated an anti-communist program there, which was successful in creating two things. First of all, a great escalation in the number of drug traffickers in Colombia and the amount of drugs produced in Colombia, but also in the amount of terrorism, because a lot of ordinary trade unionists, once they had the CIA-supported anti-communist drive to deal with, they decided that their only protection was to become a militant revolutionary movement. So it was, I think, a disastrous move on two levels, not just the drug level, but also the terrorism level. And now, in Colombia, terrorism and anti-terrorism is a drug-related industry on both sides.
But specifically with Colombia, the closest ally, the two allies that the U.S. has right now in Latin America is Mexico and Colombia. Colombia is the worst human rights violator in Latin America. Over 3,000 trade unionists have been murdered in the last 10 years. In fact, thousands of journalists have been murdered in the last few decades. The most dangerous place to be in the world if you are a trade unionist is Colombia. The most dangerous place to be in the world if you are a journalist is Colombia. Over 3 million people have been displaced from the land in Colombia by right-wing paramilitary units that then, once that land is displaced, they turn that land over to transnational corporations, to local planters and investors, to local capitalists. And so Colombia is basically a terrorist regime. It's a terrorist state. It's a nightmare state for the poor majority, and this is the state which the U.S. is totally aligned with. And so you might ask, why is that the case? Well, U.S. strategy has been to use Colombia as a beachhead to try and regain influence in Latin America. So Obama comes in and says Colombia is the best friend of the United States.
And today President Santos and I reviewed our progress, and I'm pleased to say reached agreement on several new initiatives. First, as has already been mentioned, we're moving ahead with our landmark trade agreement.
Well, if what you mean by the United States is the dominant system, the rulers in the United States, Colombia is the best friend of the United States. And what the U.S. can do now is attempt to regain its influence by trying to beef up Colombia, strengthen Colombia, and use Colombia as a staging point to counter the pink tide. Or the United States might come up with a more sophisticated strategy of accepting some type of reform in Latin America and accommodating itself to that reform. I think that's seen from the viewpoint of the U.S. political elite, that's the challenge that it faces.
In 2010, the former head of death squads in Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, claimed to have won the presidential election. Voter abstention was estimated at over 75%. Shortly before, the largest mass grave in Colombian history was discovered. Located just outside of an army base in Lima Serna, it was revealed when children drinking from a nearby stream became ill from the toxic effects of decomposing flesh. An editorial in the New York Times described Santos as a role model for Latin America.
Hundreds of bodies buried in unmarked graves. The cemetery in La Macarena has become President Álvaro Uribe's nightmare in his last days in office. La Macarena is located deep into the Colombian jungle, in a place that was once controlled by the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC. Human rights groups claim that there could be up to 2,000 bodies buried here. right behind the largest Colombian military base in the area. The government claims the dead were guerrillas, but people in the area say many were innocent civilians. Raquel Benavides certainly thinks so. She says her son was killed by the military and passed off as a guerrilla fighter. He was found in a mass grave.
They killed my son for holidays, for some cash. They killed him so that the government would get more money from abroad. I feel anger because my son was an educated person and he was the light of my eyes.
Uribe's government has been dogged by revelations that thousands of young poor men and women were killed to increase the combat body count and then presented as guerrillas. In exchange, their killers got rewards. People in the area say that most of the bodies that were buried here were brought by the Colombian military, and as you can see, they were buried in unmarked graves. This number is the number of the registry in the cemetery, and 2010 is the year they were killed. The president visited the area to reaffirm his support for Colombia's military.
In 1988, Martha Gomez's husband was murdered by an army death squad masquerading as a paramilitary group. At the time, he worked in a local banana plantation, and the workers there were striking for better pay and conditions. When Martha's husband was ordered to break the strike, he refused, and the paramilitaries beat him to a pulp. 9 years later, Martha's parents and sister were also murdered by paramilitaries in the same town.
They have a way of killing. They cut their heads off. Many people were disemboweled and their innards thrown in the river. This is the way they do it. They are laying down the seeds of terror so people will respect them, listen to them and obey them.
Without proceeding with the horrors in Colombia, what's it all about? There is an official story, one you know. It has to do with the so-called drug war. That's not taken seriously by any competent analyst, and that's no exaggeration. And there's some very good reasons for it. One reason is that narco-trafficking is part of the elite culture in Colombia. The sectors of the population to which the arms are going are up to their necks in narco-trafficking, and that's by no means any secret. Furthermore, they're not being targeted. So although the paramilitaries are right in the middle of the narco-trafficking system and are responsible for the overwhelming majority of the atrocities, up to 80% last year, if you can believe the Colombian government, they're not being targeted. That's not where the fighting is going to go, not to the territories that they control. And there's good reasons for that. They're basically the armies of the landowners, the narco-traffickers, the oil companies, and so on and so forth. You don't go after them. The Colombia plan, Clinton's Colombia plan, is specifically directed against the areas that happen to be under guerrilla control.
Se mueren. Se muere todo lo que está, desde que le caiga el veneno se muere todo. Allá tenía yo, allá habían sembrado, allá había como 50 palos de papaya, todo se murió, todo se murió.
And it's in that framework that drug production proceeds. There's a way to stop it. For example, you could allow commodity stabilization programs in the third world. You could provide a fraction of the money that's going to kill people could be used to develop alternative crops. The socioeconomic problems in Colombia, which are extremely severe, can be dealt with in several different ways. One way is to try to change the internal structure of the country, to follow programs that would in fact benefit the population instead of oppressing them. That's one way. The other way is to go in and kill them. There's a further question kind of lurking in the background, which I've never raised, but really ought to be. It's not a very profound question. And that is, what right do we have to do anything in Colombia?
Wherever you declare a war on drugs, you get more drugs and not less drugs. That's an absolute certain rule. And when 1990, I think it was when the first President Bush declared a war on drugs in Colombia, and I predicted publicly at a conference, I said, we will see more drugs coming out of Colombia now that we've declared war there, and there are more planes going back and forth, more personnel going back and forth. And lo and behold, in 10 years, it was 3 times the amount of cocaine being produced in Colombia.
So you wonder why the United States is continuing with the massive amount of aid to Colombia when none of the stated goals for Plan Colombia are being met.
Are there any indications that they're rethinking this aid now upon this news, or with what you're saying, that they haven't made a lot of progress on the goals that they had in the country?
Quite to the contrary, and I would say what this tells us is that the United States actually didn't have these goals in the first place. The aid that they're bringing in include 7 new military bases, so there's a huge new influx of military aid to Colombia rather than addressing the issues.
There is a continuum of U.S. hegemony in the Latin American context, in the region. People in Latin America are pretty aware of this. I mean, when I go down to Chile, for example, and people talk about the war on drugs or war against terror, people see the continuum, a continuation of the same mechanisms of violence that are targeting, these mechanisms are targeting exactly the same population, the poor, indigenous peoples. It follows the same logic of the U.S. Doctrines of national security in the region. They are all part of the same ideology, which is to demobilize those people who are mobilizing in order to achieve social justice. It's the same thing.